We want to let people know that, especially like with Indigenous people, reconciliation isn't just a land acknowledgement. You know, before any reconciliation happens, you need to understand the raw history of this country. You need to understand the raw history of Indigenous people in North America.
Watie Tanse, Jeremy Albert Nitsigasun, Egwa Nagoatsiko Tsenya Maga Amskwatsi Waskeginik Nuigen. Hello everyone, my name is Jeremy Albert.
My name is Nicole, and I am Métis from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, currently living in Edmonton.
Danse. My name is Cheryl Siwi-Pegaham, and I am of Cree Dene ancestry from the Little Red River Cree Nation in northern Alberta. I wanted to record this video to introduce myself and to tell you firsthand about my resource, Kanata, Contemporary Indigenous Artists and Their Music. This resource, written from an Indigenous perspective and approach, is a listening and inquiry-based teacher resource aimed at introducing students in grades 7 to 12 across Canada to 3 dynamic contemporary Indigenous artists, their music, and what inspires these artists to create. It also educates students on the evolution of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit music, events that impacted and silenced music expression, and highlights the resiliency and uprising voices of Indigenous peoples.
Colonization can be viewed as the process of taking control over another's land or territory and asserting your own laws, governments, languages, and religion on that territory and people. This is what happened to the Indigenous peoples of this place we call Canada, and continues to impact Indigenous people today.
Prior to European colonizations, First Nations and Inuit passed their music down through the oral traditions. Music was never written on paper or recorded by people themselves. Instead, elders, culture bearers, knowledge keepers, or song keepers, recognized as having these roles, stored the songs into their memory, and sang songs during ceremonies, events, and celebrations throughout the seasons. Each song had a purpose, an intention, a deep meaning, and teachings that reflected the language and voices of the elders and ancestors, and instilled meaningful connection to the land and to oneself.
The British North America Act, also known as the BNA Act 1876, along with other acts of the time, were largely responsible for the creation of the Indian Act 1876. The Indian Act was responsible for the creation of the residential school system in Canada. The residential school system operated for over 150 years, with the last school closing in Saskatchewan in 1996. The goal of the system was to eliminate First Nations language, culture, and spirituality, and was meant to assimilate First Nations children into Canadian society. The 60s scoop was also another assimilation practice used by provincial governments, where Indigenous children were removed from their homes and placed with non-Indigenous families.
It is important for teachers and students to be aware that colonization and residential schools had a devastating impact on Indigenous people and how they expressed their art, culture, and language. It was forbidden to practice ceremonies, speak their Indigenous languages, and sing and dance as some examples. Government policies, acts, and laws were set in place that did not recognize Indigenous rights, suppressed our voices, and took our children away from the only families they knew to gain access to land and resources, and to force Indigenous people to assimilate into Canadian society. Indigenous peoples weren't even allowed to vote until 1960.
In 2008, the Government of Canada officially apologized to residential school survivors for its role in the creation of the residential school system. This led to the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a commission that traveled across Canada listening to residential school survivor stories. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report along with 94 calls to action. These calls to action call on all segments of Canadian society to look at ways that it can improve its relationship with Indigenous peoples.
The TRC emphasizes the importance of restoring and revitalizing Indigenous language and culture. We know that the effects of colonization and residential schools has caused many of these languages to be at risk of being lost. In order to revitalize Indigenous culture, language initiatives are crucial. We are beginning to see more language opportunities being provided, and we are also seeing Indigenous language in songs by Indigenous artists.
There are many teachers and students who believe that Indigenous music is still locked in the past, that music only consists of powwow drums, flutes, and rattles, and that the music has not evolved. Well, let me tell you, it has evolved. It's much more than that. Our music speaks of hardships past and present, advocacy for the land and waters, celebrations of our successes, connections to our language and communities, and expressing our talents using cellos, pianos, electric guitars, turntables, electronic beats, fiddles, high drums, and so much more. So, what should teachers and students expect while going through the resource? There are lesson plans and activities under each artist section that allow students to explore, inquire, create, discuss, and engage with the artists and their music individually, in groups, or as a whole class, while learning about what these artists care about and how they express that in their music. I hope teachers and students will use this resource as an informative and engaging educational tool to help answer the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action while exploring new and exciting Indigenous artists that you may add to your music playlists.